When people talk about the most important waterways on Earth, they usually name the obvious ones. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, maybe the English Channel. But the place that may matter more than all of them is not a canal at all. It is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman, so narrow, so fragile, and so strategically dangerous that if it were ever fully blocked, the shock would be felt across the entire planet. This is the Strait of Hormuz, a place where roughly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil traded in the world passes through a corridor so tight that history, empire, trade, war, and geology have all been compressed into a single throat of water. But Hormuz is not just about oil, because near this strait lies an island where people have baked bread using red soil. A place visited by merchants, sailors, and travelers from worlds that should never have met. From Marco Polo to Arab navigators, from Persian rulers to Chinese admirals commanding fleets so enormous they made European ships look like toys. And before this story ends, we will arrive at one of the strangest alliances in regional history. The moment a Persian shah and English merchants joined forces to break one of the most powerful monopolies in the East. This is not just the story of a strait. It is the story of a choke point, a place so small on the map and so enormous in consequence that whoever controls it never just controls water. They control movement, they control wealth, and sometimes they control the future. To understand the Strait of Hormuz, you have to begin with a simple fact. This is one of the most important energy bottlenecks on Earth. The strait connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then outward to the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. That sounds geographic, technical, abstract. But in reality, it means something brutally concrete. A huge share of the oil exported by Gulf states must pass through this narrow passage. Tankers carrying energy from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iran move through a space that, at its most politically sensitive level, functions like the narrow throat of the global economy. If this waterway remains open, the system breathes. If it closes, the entire system strains. And that matters far beyond the Middle East, because the economies most dependent on energy imports, especially across Asia, feel Hormuz not as a distant map feature, but as a pressure point. China feels it. India feels it. Japan feels it. South Korea feels it. A crisis here does not stay here. It spreads into shipping costs, insurance rates, fuel prices, inflation, strategic calculations, military deployments, and diplomatic panic. That is why this strait is often discussed not merely as a route, but as a global vulnerability. And yet, what makes Hormuz so fascinating is that its modern importance is only the latest layer in a much older story. Because long before oil tankers and naval standoffs, this same region was already a gate between worlds. It was a place where geography became destiny. And to understand why, we need to go from the strait itself to the island that gave it its name. The name Hormuz carries a strange weight. Its origins are debated and layered, like so much else in this region. Some connect it to deep Persian traditions and ancient linguistic roots associated with sacred or royal meanings. Others trace it through shifts in local settlement and trade geography. But whatever the exact path, the name became attached to one of the most extraordinary islands in the region, Hormuz Island. And if the strategic map gives us one version of Hormuz, the island gives us another entirely. Because this place does not look like a normal island. It looks almost unreal. The landscapes are red, ochre, orange, and rust-colored, as if the land itself has been exposed, burned, or painted by some geological force. Hills and beaches carry shades that seem more Martian than terrestrial. And one of the reasons is the island's mineral-rich composition, especially the presence of iron oxide, which gives parts of the terrain their deep red color. But what turns geology into myth is what people did with it. Because on Hormuz, There are local culinary traditions in which a mineral-rich red earth has been used in small quantities as part of food preparation, most famously in the telling of bread made with red soil. It sounds absurd the first time you hear it, bread from the earth itself. And that is exactly why it works so well as a narrative entry point into the strait, because it reminds you that Hormuz is not merely a geopolitical corridor. It is also a place of lived culture, local adaptation, and strange intimacy between people and landscape. Here, global shipping lanes and ancient mineral soil exist side by side. Oil supertankers pass near islands where the land is colored like blood and fire. And that contrast matters, because Hormuz has always been more than a route. It has been a threshold between land and sea, empire and trade, desert and ocean, local life and world history. And once you see it that way, the next step becomes unavoidable. You begin to ask who came through this threshold in the past. The answer is almost everyone who mattered. There are places in history that feel peripheral until you look more closely. Hormuz is the opposite. At first glance, it is just a narrow maritime passage on the edge of Arabia and Persia. But once you begin tracing the routes of merchants, travelers, sailors, and empires, it starts to look less like an edge and more like a center. For centuries, this region served as a gateway linking the Indian Ocean world with the Persian interior and beyond. Goods moved through it. Ideas moved through it. Languages moved through it. Religions, rumors, technologies, and ambitions all crossed here. This is why names from radically different worlds begin to gather around Hormuz. Marco Polo passed through this world of ports and exchange. Ibn Battuta described the commercial richness of the Indian Ocean system. Even travelers from the lands of Rus and Persia entered these trade circuits, leaving behind evidence that this was not some remote maritime corner, but one of the active nodes of Afro-Eurasian exchange. That matters because it changes the scale of the story. Hormuz was not important only to the people living around it. It was important to the entire connected world of the medieval and early modern seas. If you wanted spices, textiles, horses, pearls, metals, precious goods, or access to larger oceanic circuits, this region mattered. If you wanted power over commerce between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, this region mattered. If you wanted customs revenue, strategic leverage, and influence over maritime movement, this region mattered. And that is one of the great rules of history. A narrow place through which everything must pass eventually becomes a place everyone wants to own. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating what-if moments in the history of the wider region. Because before the Portuguese, before the British, before modern oil politics, another great power reached toward these waters: China. And for a moment, it looked as though the future of the Indian Ocean might belong to them. In the early 15th century, the Indian Ocean witnessed one of the most astonishing maritime projects in human history: the expeditions of the Ming admiral Zheng He. His fleets were immense, and in later memory they became almost legendary, floating symbols of scale, wealth, organization, and imperial ambition. These were not desperate voyages by fragile outsiders. These were state-backed demonstrations of confidence, power, and reach. And when people compare the size of these Chinese ships to the vessels that later carried European explorers across the Atlantic, the contrast becomes almost theatrical. The comparison is not merely about meters and hulls. It is about possibility. Because for a brief moment, China possessed the means to dominate huge portions of the maritime world. The routes were there. The wealth was there. The technology and organization were there. The Indian Ocean was open, and the waters around Hormuz were part of that world. So why did the future not unfold that way? Why did the global age of maritime empire not become Chinese? Because one of the greatest reversals in geopolitical history happened not at sea, but at home. China turned inward. Policy changed. Priorities shifted. The great outward thrust lost political support. Naval projection shrank. Oceanic ambition was restrained. And that decision may be one of history's most expensive acts of withdrawal. Because when one power leaves space unclaimed, another eventually enters. And in the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Gulf, the power that arrived next did not come to participate in trade. It came to control it. The Portuguese were coming. When the Portuguese entered the Indian Ocean system in the early 16th century, they did not behave like merchants asking for access. They behaved like an armed disruption. Their goal was not simply to join existing trade networks, but to dominate choke points, impose naval power, and redirect commerce through a system that favored them. And there were few prizes more obvious than Hormuz. Control Hormuz, and you could influence one of the most valuable maritime gateways in the region. So that is what they moved to do. Under commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese established themselves in the area and transformed Hormuz into a fortified node of imperial power. What had been a rich commercial gateway became, in effect, part of a coercive maritime architecture. This was not just about flags and forts. It was about monopoly, customs, pressure, military presence, strategic surveillance, the ability to shape who traded, who paid, and who sailed safely. And for more than a century, Portuguese power remained a defining force here. That alone tells you how important the place was. Empires do not spend generations holding a useless island fortress in a harsh environment. They do it because the position is worth far more than the landscape suggests. But no monopoly lasts forever. And the most surprising part of this story is not that Portuguese power was challenged. It is who helped challenge it. Because eventually, a Persian ruler and English commercial interests found themselves aligned by a common enemy. And that alliance would break the old order. History often looks inevitable in retrospect, but when you are living inside it, it is made of strange bargains. One of those bargains emerged in the struggle over Hormuz. By the early 17th century, the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas I was working to strengthen Persian power and reduce foreign dominance over strategic trade zones. The Portuguese presence at Hormuz was not just a military irritation. It was an obstacle to sovereignty and commerce. At the same time, another force had entered the region with growing ambition: the English East India Company. The English were not in the Gulf out of charity, and they were not neutral observers. They were commercial opportunists operating inside an intensely competitive imperial environment. But in politics, shared interests often matter more than shared values. And in this case, Persian interests and English interests converged. Both had reasons to weaken Portuguese control, so they cooperated. The result was one of the most important realignments in the history of the region. In 1622, the Portuguese position at Hormuz was broken, and the balance of power shifted. Trade patterns changed, strategic focus moved. The old monopoly cracked. This is one of the key revelations in the story of Hormuz. Even a place that appears timeless on the map can change hands through highly specific historical moments. Moments shaped not only by geography, but by opportunism, rivalry, and temporary alliances between powers that would never have trusted each other under different circumstances. Hormuz, in other words, was not only a place where ships passed, it was a place where history condensed, a place where international politics could become visible in a single harbor. But political power was only one source of wealth here. For centuries, another treasure from these waters helped define the region's economy and reputation. Not oil, pearls. Before the age of petroleum transformed the Gulf, another form of wealth came from the sea: pearls. For generations, Gulf communities lived within an economic rhythm tied to diving, trade, risk, and luxury. The pearl industry supported merchants, boat owners, labor networks, and coastal settlements. It linked local hardship to global desire. Because a pearl begins in danger, it begins with a diver descending into the water, often with minimal protection, minimal technology, and enormous physical risk. The work was punishing, the returns uncertain, the human cost real. And yet for centuries, pearls from the Gulf helped sustain entire ways of life. This is important to remember because it shows that Hormuz and its surrounding waters were never valuable in only one way. Today we think of tankers, pipelines, and energy routes. But for much of history, wealth here moved through different materials, different bodies, different forms of extraction. The sea gave value long before oil did. And then, suddenly, an ancient world began to collapse. Not because the Gulf ran out of divers, not because people stopped wanting beauty, but because technology changed the market. The rise of cultured pearls, especially through Japanese innovation in the early 20th century, undercut the old pearl economy with devastating force. What had taken generations of dangerous human labor could now be reproduced in a new commercial system. And with that, a way of life that had endured for centuries entered decline. This is one of the most tragic patterns in history. A local world can survive storms, empires, and hardship, only to be broken by an invention made far away. Hormuz has seen this pattern before. Old orders shattered not only by armies, but by systems. And just when this story seems complete, oil, empire, trade, pearls, the region reveals yet another layer. Because nearby lies an island so large and so geologically strange that it feels like a second hidden world beside Hormuz itself. Keshem. Near the Strait of Hormuz lies Keshem Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf. And if Hormuz is the symbol of compression, a narrow throat through which the world passes, Keshem is the opposite. It feels expansive, geological, almost mythic. This island carries landscapes that seem to belong to another planet. Eroded formations, dramatic coastlines, canyons, caves, salt structures, and strange sculpted terrain make it one of the most visually distinctive places in the region. Among its most famous sites is the Valley of the Stars, a landscape shaped by erosion into forms so unusual that local imagination and geology seem to merge. To some, it looks like the aftermath of cosmic violence. To others, a masterpiece of wind, water, and time. And then there are the caves. Keshem is associated with one of the most impressive salt cave systems in the world, stretching for extraordinary distances through mineral formations that remind you, once again, that this entire region is not only politically strategic, it is geologically theatrical. That matters because one of the hidden strengths of a story like Hormuz is contrast. You begin with oil choke points and military relevance. Then you move into red earth and edible soil. Then medieval trade. Then Chinese fleets. Then Portuguese forts. Then Persian-English alliances. Then pearls. Then salt caves and landscapes carved into dreamlike forms. And suddenly, the strait is no longer just a news headline or a military briefing. It becomes what it has always been: a layered world where geography, history, livelihood, empire, and imagination all occupy the same narrow zone. So what makes the Strait of Hormuz so extraordinary? It is not only the number of tankers passing through it. It is not only the volume of oil. It is not only the threat of crisis. What makes Hormuz extraordinary is that this place has almost never stopped mattering. Across centuries, the reason changed. Once it mattered because it connected trade worlds, then because it attracted empires, then because it sat inside maritime competition, then because pearls brought wealth from the sea, now because energy flows through it at planetary scale. But the deeper pattern never changed. Hormuz is one of those rare places where history does not pause. It simply changes costume. The ships change, the cargo changes, the languages change, the empires change, the technologies change, but the logic remains the same. A narrow place through which too much must pass becomes a place no one can ignore. And that is why this strait keeps returning to global attention again and again. Because it is not just a waterway, it is leverage. The kind of leverage that can shape diplomacy, trigger military planning, influence energy security, and remind entire continents that their prosperity may depend on a passage of water only a few dozen kilometers wide. History can sometimes feel vast and abstract. Hormuz proves that sometimes history compresses itself into something much smaller, into a bottleneck, into a harbor, into an island of red earth, into a throat of water where the world holds its breath. So the next time someone names the most important waterways on Earth, remember this: one of them is not famous because it is long, not because it is beautiful, not because it is easy to cross, but because it is narrow enough to matter. A place where oil, empire, geology, trade, pearls, and memory have all been forced together for centuries. A place where Marco Polo passed, where Chinese fleets could have changed history, where Portuguese guns built a monopoly, where a Persian shah and English merchants shattered it, where divers risked their lives for pearls, and where even the soil itself could become part of the story. The Strait of Hormuz is not just where ships pass, it is where history tightens. And the only real question is the same one that has haunted this region for centuries. Who will control it next? If you enjoyed this video, write in the comments which part of the story surprised you most: the oil choke point, the Red Earth Island, the Chinese fleet, the Portuguese monopoly, or the collapse of the Pearl World. And if you want more stories like this, places where geography changed civilization and where history is buried deeper than textbooks admit, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because some of the most important places on Earth are also the easiest to underestimate.